Carl Eugene Watts, the phantom with evil eyes when people think of America's most terrifying serial killers. Names like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and John Wayne Gacy immediately come to mind. Their notoriety has made them symbols of depravity immortalized in documentaries, true crime series, and public imagination. But lurking beneath that spotlight are figures even more dangerous killers, whose names have all but vanished from public memory despite body counts. That rival surpassed the most infamous murderers in history. Carl Eugene Watts, known chillingly as the Sunday morning slasher, may have murdered more people than any other serial killer in American history. While Bundy admitted to killing 30 and Dahmer took 17 lives, Watts is suspected of murdering over 100 people and yet his name remains obscure, buried in dusty case files and faded headlines. Born on November 7, 1953 in Killeen, Texas, Watts seemed like an ordinary child. Raised primarily by his mother after his father left the family, he was quiet and withdrawn. But everything changed when, at age 8, contracted meningitis, severe illness that required intensive hospitalization. After his recovery, relatives noticed a profound shift. The once mild-mannered child became deeply withdrawn, paranoid, and fixated on bizarre spiritual beliefs, particularly about women having evil eyes. By 15, Watts had already committed his first known assault, attacking a woman while delivering newspapers. It was just the beginning. Throughout his teenage years, he was suspected in a series of violent incidents against women, yet authorities consistently failed to build cases against him. What made Watts particularly terrifying was not just his brutality, but his unpredictability. He didn't follow a clear pattern, didn't sexually assault his victims, didn't rob them. His killings spanned from strangulation to drowning to stabbing. He told investigators he killed women who possessed evil eyes to purge the world of their evil spirits. This randomness confounded law enforcement. Murders occurring across different states using different methods seemed unconnected, but they were all the work of one man operating under a twisted internal logic only he could understand. Psychologist Dr. Harley Stock, who examined hundreds of violent offenders, studied Watts during his time as a suspect in Michigan. He suggested that although Watts didn't sexually assault his victims, his crimes were rooted in sexual pathology. Stock believed. Developed elaborate fantasies around certain types of women, almost exclusively attractive white females with long hair. These fantasies were not about desire but destruction. In 1981, Watts moved to Texas and found employment in Columbus. But what he really did was hunt. Every weekend he drove over an hour to Houston, a city overwhelmed by violent crime. In that chaos, Watts found his perfect cover. He confessed to killing at least 12 women in Texas during this period, women like Linda Tilley, drowned in her bathtub. Elizabeth Montgomery, stabbed to death just hours before Susan Wolfe met the same fate. Ellen Tam hanged. 14-year-old Emily LaCaw, whom he claimed had evil eyes. None of the victims had anything in common, except that they crossed paths with Watts. He left no witnesses, no evidence, no motive that police could trace. But in 1982, his spree came to an end because of a remarkable act of courage. On May 23rd, he broke into a Houston apartment and attacked Melinda Aguilar, choking her unconscious and tying her hands. She wasn't unconscious, though just faking it. While Watts prepared to murder her roommate, Aguilar escaped by throwing herself from a balcony with her hands still bound. Ash! She screamed until neighbors called the police. That desperate act saved both women's lives and led to Watts's arrest. What followed was one of the most controversial plea deals in U.S. legal history. Facing little physical evidence, Texas prosecutors offered Watts a 60-year sentence in exchange for confessions to 13 murders. No death penalty, no life sentence. They assumed he'd never walk free. The possibility of freeing a man who confessed to killing over a dozen women sparked national outrage. Michigan authorities scrambled to find a loophole. Since the Texas plea didn't protect him from prosecution elsewhere, Michigan reopened cold cases. Eventually, a witness identified Watts in a 1979 stabbing. He was extradited, tried, and sentenced to life without parole, but they were wrong. Texas parole laws meant Watts was eligible for release by 2004. Detective Tom Ladd, who spent years investigating Watts, recalled asking him if he was relieved to be caught. He felt remorse. Watts answered coldly, "If I get out, I'll do it again. No regret, no hesitation." His death closed the book on a man suspected of killing more than 100 people but left behind a haunting question. How many others like him walk among you unnoticed, unpunished, and unknown? Carl Eugene Watts died in prison from prostate cancer on September 21, 2007. The New Bedford Highway Killer. A ghost on the asphalt between 1988 and 1989. A silent predator haunted the streets of New Bedford, Massachusetts. Over the span of just 13 months, at least 9 women were murdered, and 2 more disappeared without a trace. Their bodies were dumped along highways and rural backroads, positioned eerily, feet pointed toward the asphalt as if in ritual. The killer vanished just as suddenly as he appeared. To this day, his identity remains unknown. What makes this case so haunting is not just the brutality of the crimes, but the way they've faded from memory, obscured by time, overshadowed by more famous serial murderers, and buried beneath the failures of a justice system that never solved them. The victims were all women in their 20s and 30s, many struggling with addiction, prostitution, or poverty. But they weren't nameless. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, people with families, hopes, and stories. The killer knew exactly what he was doing. He chose women who were vulnerable, not just physically, but socially. Women less likely to be missed. Women less likely to generate headlines. The first body was discovered in July 1988, along Route 140, Deborah Medeiros had been missing since May. She was found in advanced decomposition, strangled with a bra wrapped around her neck, feet pointed toward the highway. This detail, her feet facing traffic, would become the killer's signature. A few weeks later, another woman, Nancy Lee Pava, was found along Interstate 195. She had left a pub after a fight with her boyfriend. Like Medeiros, she'd been strangled and posed the same way. The pattern was forming, but police were slow to connect the dots. Each case was initially treated as an isolated tragedy. As the bodies mounted, the horror deepened. Rochelle Dufilly, Mary Rose Santos, Sandra Botello, and others, all found along desolate highways, all sharing similar causes of death and staged in the same disturbing pose. Law enforcement eventually realized they were dealing with a serial killer, but they were already behind. The killer's knowledge of the region suggested someone familiar with backroads and secluded areas. He picked dump sites unlikely to be discovered quickly. Some bodies weren't found for months. Others were so badly decomposed that forensic evidence was scarce. What emerged was a portrait of a calculated predator, someone who studied his environment and preyed on society's blind spots. He knew these women's disappearances might not spark urgent investigations. Tragically, he was right. 2 suspects emerged during the investigation: Kenneth Ponte, a local attorney, and Tony DeGrazia, a man with ties to several victims. Ponte was indicted for 1 murder, but the charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence. He died years later. DeGrazia, who had been in custody, was found dead in suspicious circumstances just after Ponte's release. His death was initially ruled a homicide, then reclassified as a suicide, despite contradictory autopsy findings. Both men took their secrets to the grave. Then came the international twist. In Lisbon, Portugal, home to many of New Bedford's immigrants, 3 sex workers were murdered and disemboweled in 1992-93. The cases were eerily similar. Portuguese detectives flew to Massachusetts. FBI agents flew to Lisbon. Investigators even explored links to similar killings across Europe, from the Netherlands to the Czech Republic. Then came the international twist. In Lisbon, Portugal, home to many of New Bedford's immigrants, 3 sex workers were murdered and disemboweled in 1992-93. The cases were eerily similar. Portuguese detectives flew to Massachusetts. FBI agents flew to Lisbon. Investigators even explored links to similar killings across Europe, from the Netherlands to the Czech Republic. One theory emerged: the killer had become a long-haul trucker. It would explain the mobility, the vanishing act, and the scattered geography of both U.S. and European murders. But it was only a theory, one of many that led nowhere definitive. For all the efforts, the New Bedford highway killer was never caught. The case remains open, with Massachusetts State Police still following up on tips. But the passage of time has eroded hope. DNA evidence wasn't routinely collected in the late 80s. Bodies were exposed to the elements. Many details were lost forever. But what truly allowed this killer to succeed wasn't just opportunity or intelligence. It was indifference. The system failed these women because of who they were: impoverished, addicted, vulnerable. And their killer exploited that indifference like a weapon. Today, over 30 years later, the pain lingers. Families still wait. Investigators still wonder. And somewhere, perhaps a man walks free, his trail gone cold, his name forgotten, but his crimes forever imprinted on the blacktop arteries of Massachusetts. Paul John Knowles. Charm, chaos, and cold-blooded murder in the pantheon of American serial killers. Paul John Knowles stands out not just for the number of victims, but for the way he turned his killing spree into a performance. Known as the Casanova Killer, Knowles didn't murder for money, lust, or revenge. He murdered for attention. He wanted headlines, movies, books. He wanted the world to know his name and fear it. His rampage began in 1974 after a devastating personal rejection. Knowles had been corresponding with a woman named Angela Kovic, a San Francisco they were planning to marry. But just before the wedding, Kovic sensed something deeply wrong. She abruptly ended the engagement, telling friends she had a terrible feeling about him. That same night, Knowles claimed he killed 3 strangers in San Francisco. Those murders were never confirmed, but the spree had begun. Unlike other serial killers who followed a method or preferred type, Knowles was completely unpredictable. His victims included men and women, children and seniors. Some he killed during burglaries, others he picked off simply because they were there. Left no pattern, only bodies. Estimates of his victim count vary, but Knowles himself claimed 35 murders. Law enforcement confirmed at least 18. The randomness made him nearly impossible to profile. He didn't always kill. Sometimes he robbed, sometimes he raped, sometimes he talked. One minute he was strangling a woman with her own pantyhose. The next, he was sharing drinks at a bar, laughing like a movie star. Knowles believed he was destined for infamy. He fantasized about being immortalized on screen. He once said he wanted any profits from his story to be split with his mother. It wasn't enough to kill. He needed to be remembered. One of the most disturbing examples of his manipulative charm came when he broke into the Florida home of Barbara Ann and Beverly Mabby. He tied up Beverly, salted her, then forced Barbara to go with him, telling her he would let her child live if she cooperated. During the drive that followed, Barbara used every bit of her intelligence and courage to survive. She told Knowles he looked like Robert Redford. She praised his voice. She said she worked in radio and could help tell his story. Knowles believed her. He let her live. When he finally left her bound in a motel room, he said, "I love you," as if the horror he inflicted was somehow romantic. His murders were as varied as they were horrific. In Jacksonville, he tied up 65-year-old Alice Curtis and gagged her so tightly she choked to death. Then he stole her car. He later murdered 49-year-old Marjorie Howie and took her television. When he broke into Kathy Sue Pierce's home in Georgia, he strangled her in front of her toddler, son leaving the child physically unharmed but alone with his mother's corpse. The Carr family murder in Milledgeville, Georgia, showed just how savage Knowles could be. The crime scene was described as animalistic, with broken mirrors, blood on the walls, and evidence of a frenzied attack. Yet just hours later, Knowles strolled into a local bar wearing one of his victims' shirts, casually flirting with women. His killing spree spanned 6 states. He left a trail of fear from Florida to Connecticut to Texas, despite being one of the FBI's most wanted men. He always seemed one step ahead. He changed cars, changed clothes, changed names. He blended in, smiling, polite, deadly. But eventually his luck ran out. After murdering yet another couple, Knowles was spotted driving a stolen vehicle in Georgia. A high-speed chase followed, crashed through a police roadblock, seriously injuring Officer Jerry Key. A foot chase ensued, helicopters buzzing overhead, bloodhounds tracking his scent. The manhunt ended in the woods, where Knowles was cornered by a local Vietnam veteran named David Clark. Holding a shotgun, Clark ordered Knowles to the ground and waited for authorities to arrive. Knowles surrendered. Even in custody, he tried to control the narrative. He gave audio record confessions to investigators, sharing lurid details of his crimes. But his reasons weren't remorse. They were theatrical. He wanted the tapes to be his final performance. Unfortunately, or perhaps fittingly, those tapes were destroyed in a flood at the federal courthouse in Macon, Georgia. All that remained were transcripts and memories. 1 month after his capture, on December 18, 1974, Knowles was being transported by police to search for a hidden weapon. In the car with him were Sheriff Earl Lee in Georgia, Bureau of Investigation Agent Ronnie Angel. Knowles had secretly managed to bend a paperclip into a makeshift key and slipped out of his handcuffs. He lunged for Lee's revolver. In the struggle that followed, Angel fired 3 times, killing him instantly. Paul John Knowles died as chaotically as he lived, violently, suddenly, and with no apology. There was no trial, no final testimony. Just a bloody end to a life spent treating human beings as disposable props in his quest for fame. He got his headlines, but not the movie, not the book. Instead of a glamorous legacy, Knowles became a cautionary tale, a reminder that the most dangerous monsters are sometimes the ones smiling back at you, confident they're writing their own legend in blood. The Atlanta Ripper. Murder in the shadow of Jim Crow between 1909 and 1914. The streets of Atlanta ran red with blood. At least 15 women, all young, all black or mixed race, were found murdered. Their throats slashed so deeply some were nearly decapitated. Their bodies were mutilated post-mortem. Their deaths sparked whispers of a Southern Jack the Ripper, but justice never came. The killer was never identified. The case was never solved. And the victims, educated, hardworking, respected women, were erased by history. Failed not just by their killer, but by a society that didn't consider them worth saving. This is the story of the Atlanta Ripper, America's first documented serial killer to target black women during one of the nation's most racially volatile eras. It's not just a story of murder, it's a story of indifference, of fear, and of institutional silence. The early 1900s in Atlanta were defined by racial terror. Just 3 years before the murders began, white mobs sparked by rumors of black men assaulting white women tore through the city. At least 25 African Americans were slaughtered in the 1906 Atlanta race riot. Jim Crow laws ruled. Black citizens were disenfranchised, segregated, and often criminalized for simply existing. Into this world stepped a monster. The first known victim was Belle Walker, a 49-year-old cook. On May 28, 1911, her sister found her lying just yards from her home on Garibaldi Street, her throat slashed so deeply it was nearly severed. The murder was brutal, but the press gave it little attention. The Atlanta Constitution ran a short article under the headline, "Negro Woman Killed. No Clue to Slayer." Weeks later, 22-year-old Addie Watts was found dead, killed in nearly the same way. Then Lizzie Watts, then Mary Putnam. One by one, young black women were found mutilated and discarded. All had their throats cut from ear to ear. All were described as attractive, well-dressed, and educated. These weren't sex workers or petty criminals. These were domestic workers, clerks, teachers, pillars of their communities. Weeks later, 22-year-old Addie Watts was found dead, killed in nearly the same way. Then Lizzie Watts. Then Mary Putnam. One by one, young black women were found mutilated and discarded. All had their throats cut from ear to ear. All were described as attractive, well-dressed, and educated. These weren't sex workers or petty criminals. These were domestic workers, clerks, teachers, pillars of their communities. And yet, no one seemed to care. The killings continued into 1912 and 1913. More bodies, more silence. What made the Atlanta Ripper especially terrifying was the methodical nature of his violence. He seemed to know the streets intimately. The old Fourth Ward, where many murders occurred, was poorly lit and underserved by public transportation. Women often had to walk long distances through dark, isolated routes to get to and from work. He knew their paths. He knew their patterns. And he struck with surgical brutality. In several cases, the bodies were found near train tracks, suggesting the killer used the railway system to move between neighborhoods or flee crime scenes. Some victims were found posed or partially arranged, indicating ritual or symbolic intention. At least one witness survived an encounter. After Lena Sharp was murdered on July 1, 1911, her head nearly severed from her body, her daughter claimed to have seen the killer fleeing the scene, but she was too terrified to give police much to work with. Other reports mentioned a suspicious man, sometimes well-dressed, sometimes scruffy, seen near crime scenes, but nothing was ever confirmed. Notes were occasionally left at scenes, some signed Jack the Ripper. Whether these were authentic or not, they added to the panic. The implication was clear. Someone wanted to be feared, and someone knew the legend of the original Ripper in London, that someone was using terror to send a message. But the message was largely ignored by those in power. Police investigations were almost non-existent. Despite clear patterns and repeated appeals from black community leaders, the Atlanta Police Department barely pursued the case. There were no formal task forces, no forensic work, no arrests. Some officials insisted the women had been killed by different attackers. Others hinted the women had brought violence upon themselves. No one was ever charged. It wasn't just neglect, it was systemic failure, a city desperate to present itself as modern and progressive to the north. City leaders did not want headlines about a serial killer targeting black women. The city's public image mattered more than the bodies piling up in black neighborhoods. To this day, the killer has never been identified. He may have died. He may have moved to another city. He may have been someone respected, someone whose public face masked monstrous urges. We'll never know. The case faded into silence, overshadowed by newer crimes, fresher fears, and more headline-friendly victims. The Atlanta Ripper didn't just slaughter women. He exposed the cruel truth of early 20th century America, that black lives, especially the lives of black women, were expendable. Their deaths were brushed aside, their stories forgotten. Modern criminologists have revisited the case. Some believe the same killer may have struck in other cities. Others argue that multiple killers may have been involved, copycats, opportunists, but without proper records, autopsies, or investigative files, the truth is buried. What remains is the legacy of 15 women, and perhaps more whose lives were stolen and whose names were nearly erased. Their stories have been reduced to footnotes in history books, if they appear at all. It's about who we choose to protect, who we choose to remember, and who we allow to be forgotten. But they mattered. They were loved. They were mourned. They deserved justice. The Atlanta Ripper case reminds us that justice isn't just about catching killers. David Carpenter, a predator in the pines in the late 1970s and early 1980s. California's trails were serene sanctuaries. Families hiked under redwoods. Joggers ran beneath the golden sun. But behind the trees, something waited, something calculating, cold, and armed. David Joseph Carpenter, later dubbed the Trailside Killer, transformed the Bay Area's beloved hiking trails into hunting grounds, turning nature's refuge into a place of fear. Carpenter was born on May 6, 1930, in San Francisco. His early years were defined by shame and humiliation. He had a debilitating stutter that isolated him from other children. Classmates mocked him. Teachers lost patience. The verbal abuse and rejection etched deep scars. He grew up angry, withdrawn, and painfully self-conscious. His stutter wasn't just a speech impediment. It was the fuel behind decades of rage. He resented everyone, especially women. Women who laughed at him. Women who rejected him. Women who, in his twisted mind, had power he could never have. As a young adult, Carpenter turned violent. He developed a disturbing fascination with guns and control. In 1960, he was convicted of molesting a child and sentenced to 14 years in prison. There, instead of rehabilitation, he stewed in his own hatred. When he was released in 1970, he appeared reformed, working as a printer, even getting married. But behind that quiet exterior was a man planning his second life, not as a citizen, but as a killer. Carpenter's evolution from sexual predator to serial murderer was slow, methodical, and deliberate. He began studying California's state parks and hiking trails. He learned their patterns, the quiet hours, the blind curves, the remote bends in the path where screams would never carry. He mapped escape routes. He memorized ranger patrols. He knew the terrain better than most locals. In August 1979, the first attack occurred. Etta Kane, 44, was shot while hiking on Mount Tamalpais. There was no warning, no apparent motive, just sudden, silent death. The random nature of the killing made it nearly impossible to solve. Then came another, and another. Each time the victims were alone, or in pairs, always vulnerable, always exposed. What made Carpenter especially terrifying was his discipline. He wasn't impulsive. He waited. He planned. He stalked. Victims were often forced off the trail at gunpoint and marched into deeper woods. There, Carpenter would sometimes sexually assault them, always shoot them, and then disappear like mist between the trees. The psychological torment he inflicted, forcing victims to walk, to beg to realize what was coming, was a cruelty unique even among serial killers. Unlike others driven by lust or chaos, Carpenter was driven by something colder: control. Every crime was calculated, every shot measured. His stutter, so defining in his early life, became a paradoxical advantage. Victims didn't see him as threatening. Some even found him disarming. But when he pulled the trigger, the transformation was total. On March 8, 1980, 19-year-old Heather Skaggs was hiking alone when she vanished. Her body was found days later. She had been sexually assaulted and shot. Her murder marked an escalation. Carpenter was getting bolder, more aggressive. The attacks were coming faster now. By 1981, 7 people were dead. More had survived but were left traumatized, some with bullet wounds. Others with nothing but memories of a stuttering man who turned friendly conversation into horror. Investigators struggled. Remote crime scenes were difficult to access. Evidence was scarce. The attacks spanned multiple counties, and local jurisdictions weren't initially coordinating their efforts. But a few threads finally began to connect. Survivors mentioned the killer's stutter. Ballistics matched bullets across several scenes. The profile emerged: middle-aged, male, local, familiar with trails, comfortable with firearms, and carrying deep-rooted resentment. Then came the break. A tip led police to David Carpenter. His criminal past, his proximity to the parks, his access to firearms, it all aligned. When investigators searched his home, they found maps, guns, and items belonging to victims. Most damning were the ballistics. His revolver matched the bullets retrieved from multiple bodies. Carpenter was arrested on May 14, 1981. At trial, survivors testified in chilling detail. He described how he approached them as a fellow hiker, casual, friendly, then drew a gun and became a monster. They spoke of long walks into the woods, of psychological games of terror that lasted hours. He was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. But like many on California's death row, Carpenter never faced execution. Instead, he lived out the decades behind bars, his crimes fading from public memory. Even as the families of his victims continued to grieve. He died in prison on May 1, 2021, of natural causes. And while his name never became as notorious as Bundy or Gacy, his impact was just as devastating. He lived to be over 90 longer than any of the people he murdered in cold blood. The legacy of the Trailside Killer is more than a body count. He shattered the illusion that nature was safe, that violence stayed in cities. After his attacks, hiking habits changed. Park attendance dropped. People stopped walking alone. Trails that once promised peace and beauty were now marked by blood. David Carpenter didn't just kill people. He altered the way Northern California saw its forests, turned beauty into horror.